Evelyn Carter was a woman who carried herself with a calm elegance that made people pause when she entered a room. She was not only admired for her extraordinary business success, but also respected for the way she treated everyone from corporate leaders to waiters at a small cafe with the same level of dignity. She had built her fortune through years of resilience, intelligent decisions, and a belief that kindness could exist alongside power. On this particular day, Evelyn had chosen to take a break from her packed schedule and enjoy lunch at a luxury seaside restaurant, one that was known for its breathtaking view of the ocean. The sun glistened across the calm waves. A gentle breeze swept through the patio, and soft laughter from nearby tables blended with the sound of the sea. Evelyn sat at a corner table wearing a simple but elegant blue dress, her favorite color. To her, blue symbolized peace, stability, and wisdom values she carried into everything she did. She placed her phone aside, determined not to be distracted by constant emails and calls. Today, she wanted to slow down, breathe, and simply enjoy the moment. The waiter had just served her a glass of fresh juice, the kind she loved, bright orange, chilled, and refreshing. Evelyn lifted it slightly, smiled at the thought of quiet relaxation, and leaned back to enjoy the view. But peace rarely lasts long when envy lurks nearby. The restaurant's manager, a man named Richard, stood inside watching her. He was known among the staff for his arrogance, his quick temper, and his ability to make employees nervous with just a glare. Richard disliked Evelyn, though he had no personal history with her. In truth, he disliked anyone who reminded him of his own failures. Seeing a powerful black woman commanding respect everywhere she went triggered something bitter inside him. He muttered to himself, "People like her think they own the world. Not in my restaurant." Beside him, a young waitress named Claire nervously adjusted her apron. She was new, still learning the ropes, and desperate to keep her job. Richard leaned close and whispered sharply, "You see that woman out there? She thinks she's better than everyone. I want you to serve her again, and this time make a mistake. Teach her a lesson." Claire froze. "Sir, I don't understand." Richard smirked. "Accidents happen. Maybe her drink doesn't quite make it to the table. Maybe it lands elsewhere." He gave her a look that carried both command and threat. Claire's heart pounded. She needed this job. Rent was due, and her bills were piling up. She knew if she refused, Richard would find a reason to fire her. Reluctantly, she carried another glass of juice toward Evelyn's table, her hands trembling slightly. Evelyn, unaware of the storm about to unfold, was reading the menu with a relaxed smile. Claire approached, her face pale, her thoughts racing. She prayed she wouldn't have to go through with what her boss demanded. But then it happened, whether by her trembling nerves or by Richard's manipulative design. The glass tipped forward. The bright orange liquid spilled directly onto Evelyn's head, splashing across her hair and face, dripping down onto her blue dress. The patio went silent. Gasps rippled through the tables around them. A man in the corner dropped his fork. A woman covered her mouth in shock. Everyone's eyes darted between the billionaire, now soaked in juice, and the horrified waitress standing frozen with the empty glass in her hand. Evelyn blinked, stunned, as the cold juice trickled down her forehead. Her first instinct was not anger, it was disbelief. She slowly set down the napkin she had been holding and looked up at Claire. The young waitress was already apologizing frantically. I'm so sorry. It was an accident. I didn't mean to. Please forgive me." Richard appeared almost instantly, feigning surprise, though a glimmer of satisfaction flickered in his eyes. He loudly scolded Claire, but his words were hollow, rehearsed. "What's wrong with you? How clumsy can you be? You've just embarrassed the restaurant." But Evelyn, even in that moment, sensed the falseness in his tone. Something in his smirk, his posture, told her this was not an accident. She glanced at him briefly, her sharp mind already piecing the puzzle together. The crowd waited for her reaction. Some expected her to explode in fury, to storm out, or to demand the immediate firing of the waitress. After all, she was a billionaire, a woman of power. and most people in her position would have lashed out. Instead, Evelyn slowly reached for a napkin, dabbing her face gently. She looked at Claire not with anger, but with calm eyes that carried something deeper. The young woman's hands shook as she tried to explain again, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. Evelyn gave her a small, steady look and said softly, "It's all right. Accidents happen." Those words shocked everyone. The diners exchanged glances, whispering under their breath. Some admired her composure, others questioned it. Why wasn't she furious? Why wasn't she demanding justice? But Evelyn Carter had lived through boardroom betrayals, corporate smear campaigns, and countless attempts to undermine her. She had learned that true power was not in the loudness of a reaction, but in the quiet strength of control. And while she seemed calm on the outside, her mind was already turning. She knew this was no simple accident. She had no intention of letting it slide. Richard, noticing her calmness, grew uneasy. He had expected her to lose her temper, to give him a scene that he could later twist against her. Instead, she had responded with grace. But he underestimated her. Evelyn smiled faintly, though her eyes carried a sharpness that only a few noticed. To the crowd, she appeared composed, forgiving, even generous. But inside, she had already decided this incident would not end here. There would be consequences, not through rage, but through something far more effective. For now, though, she allowed the moment to pass. She quietly requested a towel, declined the manager's forced apologies, and resumed her meal as if nothing had happened. The diners remained restless, their curiosity growing. They didn't know it yet, but they had just witnessed the beginning of a story that would leave them speechless. Evelyn Carter was not the kind of woman who shouted when wronged. She was the kind of woman who planned. And Richard, along with anyone else who doubted her strength, was about to learn that when a powerful woman chooses silence, it's not weakness, it's the storm gathering before the strike. Evelyn Carter sat silently, the last drops of orange juice trickling down her face as the patio buzzed with uneasy whispers. To the people watching, it looked like she had chosen to forgive the waitress and ignore the humiliation. But inside Evelyn's heart, a fire was slowly being lit. She was not the kind of woman who shouted or cursed in public. She had learned long ago that silence, when used with purpose, could be louder than the fiercest scream. Her life had not been easy. Growing up in a small neighborhood with very little money, she had been taught that respect was not something freely given, it was something you carried within yourself. As a child, she had been overlooked, underestimated, even ridiculed for dreaming bigger than the world thought she deserved. Teachers told her to be realistic, neighbors laughed at her goals, and even friends sometimes advised her to lower her expectations. But Evelyn had always chosen silence over arguments. Instead of defending herself with words, she proved herself with actions. That same spirit rose in her now as she sat at the seaside restaurant, juice staining her blue dress. The waitress, Claire, was trembling beside her, trying to apologize again. Evelyn reached out and placed her hand gently on Claire's arm. "It's all right," she said, her voice calm, her eyes steady. The young woman broke down in tears, whispering that she hadn't wanted to do it, that it wasn't really her choice. Evelyn didn't press her for details yet. She simply nodded, letting the girl know she had been heard. Richard, the arrogant manager, didn't like this quiet exchange. He had hoped Evelyn would explode, creating a scene that he could later twist into a story about how billionaires believed they were above everyone else. But Evelyn didn't play the role he had written for her. Instead, she calmly asked for a clean towel, wiped her face, and continued sitting as if nothing had happened. The restaurant fell into an uncomfortable hush. People expected drama, shouting, or anger, but all they saw was a woman who held her dignity with unshakable grace. And that was the beginning of Richard's mistake. He thought Evelyn's silence meant defeat. In truth, it meant strategy. As Evelyn sat there, she thought about the countless times in her career when she had been disrespected in boardrooms. Men had spoken over her, dismissed her ideas, even tried to claim her work as their own. Early in her career, she had once been laughed at by a panel of investors who told her she didn't look like someone who could run a business empire. That memory still lingered in her mind, not as pain but as fuel, had quietly walked out of that room, gone back to her office, and worked harder than ever until the same investors who had rejected her later begged to buy shares in her company. She had not needed to scream or beg for their respect. She had earned it by proving them wrong now at the restaurant. She knew the best revenge was not a loud reaction, but a quiet one that would echo longer than any argument. She let the chatter of the diners wash over her, their curiosity feeding her determination. To them she looked calm, almost forgiving. But deep inside she was already planning her next steps. Claire stood awkwardly nearby, unsure of what to do. Richard barked at her to get back to work, but Evelyn interrupted softly. Let her stay for a moment. Her voice carried authority, the kind that could silence a room without needing to rise in volume. Richard frowned, but he didn't dare argue. He could feel that she was not someone to be trifled with, even if he still underestimated her power. Evelyn turned to Claire and asked in a low voice, "Tell me, was this truly an accident?" Claire hesitated, her lips trembling. But before she could answer, Richard cut in sharply. "Of course it was. She's clumsy, that's all. Now enough of this nonsense." Evelyn's eyes locked on his calm but piercing. She didn't argue. She didn't accuse. She simply looked at him in silence, holding his gaze until he looked away. That silence was heavier than any accusation. The diners who watched felt the tension, as if something invisible but powerful had just shifted in the air. When her meal finally arrived, Evelyn ate quietly, each bite deliberate, as though nothing unusual had happened. But her mind was racing. She knew Richard had orchestrated the humiliation, and she also knew that revenge, if taken impulsively, would only make her appear weak. But if taken with patience, with strategy, it could create not only justice for herself but also a transformation for everyone watching as she finished her meal. Evelyn thought about the legacy she wanted to leave behind. Money and success had given her freedom, but it was her character that had built her empire. She didn't want to just punish Richard. She wanted to expose the rot in his leadership, the arrogance that hurt not only her, but the employees who worked under him. She thought of Claire Young, fearful, manipulated, and realized this was bigger than spilled juice. This was about creating a moment that could inspire others, a moment that could remind people what true strength looks like. When she finally stood to leave, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. She picked up her purse, smiled faintly, and thanked Claire for her service. Then, without another word, she walked out with her head held high, the afternoon sun catching the calm confidence in her eyes. The diners would talk about this for weeks. Some would say she was too kind, others would say she was too soft. But those who truly understood power would recognize what had just happened. Evelyn Carter had shown that silence could be a weapon, that grace could be sharper than anger. And that respect was never lost by refusing to fight in the mud. Richard, however, remained blind to the danger. He thought he had gotten away with it. He thought the juice on her dress was the end of the story. What he didn't know was that Evelyn Carter had just begun writing a new chapter, one that would change not only his fate, but the future of the entire restaurant chain. Because, while the world saw silence, Evelyn was planning. And when her plans came to light, no one, especially Richard, would be ready for the storm hidden behind her calm smile. Asterisk. The restaurant patio was buzzing long after Evelyn Carter left her table. People had witnessed something they didn't quite understand. They had seen a billionaire humiliated in public, drenched in juice, mocked indirectly by the very people who were supposed to serve her. And yet, instead of anger, she had walked away with calm dignity. That silence unsettled them more than any outburst could have done at one table. A couple leaned closer, whispering, "Did you see that?" She didn't even raise her voice. "I would have demanded they fire the waitress right on the spot." Another diner shook his head. No, that wasn't weakness. That was power. The way she looked at the manager, did you see? He looked away. That's not someone to underestimate. The whispers grew into a quiet storm. Some people admired her grace, others thought she should have made a scene, and a few even laughed, mistaking her silence for defeat. What no one realized was that Evelyn's calmness had already planted seeds in every heart watching. Her silence was echoing louder than words, making each person reflect on how they would have handled the same humiliation. Claire, the young waitress, had slipped into the back room after Evelyn left, her hands still trembling. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she leaned against the counter. She whispered to herself, "Why did I do it? Why did I listen to him?" She felt sick with guilt. She had seen Evelyn's eyes, not angry, not accusing, but knowing. It was as if Evelyn had looked straight into her soul, seen the truth she was too afraid to speak aloud. Richard, meanwhile, strutted across the dining floor, pretending everything was fine. He laughed loudly, trying to shake off the discomfort that Evelyn's silence had left behind. "Just a silly accident, nothing more," he said to a few regulars. But behind his smug smile, he felt a crack in his confidence. The way Evelyn had stared at him without saying a word had unsettled him. He had dealt with difficult customers before, but none had carried the same unspoken weight she did. As the hours passed and new diners arrived, the earlier incident became the story of the day. The waiters whispered in the kitchen, the bartenders exchanged glances, and even the chef, who rarely left the kitchen, came out to ask what had happened. Stories started to change as they spread. Some said Evelyn had been furious, but hid it. Others claimed she had whispered something threatening to Richard before leaving. Few even said she smiled because she already owned the place. The truth didn't matter anymore. The whispers had taken a life of their own. Evelyn, meanwhile, sat in her car by the seaside, watching the waves. She wasn't angry, though she had every right to be. Instead, she thought about the crowd she had just left behind. She knew they would whisper, speculate, and spread the story far beyond those tables, and that was exactly what she wanted. Didn't need to fight in the open when whispers could carry her message further than her own voice ever could. She thought of her younger self, sitting in classrooms where other children whispered behind her back, mocking her secondhand clothes, and big dreams. She had learned then that whispers could either destroy you or drive you. She had chosen to let them drive her, to prove every whisper wrong. And now, all these years later, she was doing the same thing. She would let the whispers build a stage for her next move. Back at the restaurant, "I can't do this anymore," she said quietly. "What you asked me to do, it was wrong. She didn't deserve that." Richard sneered. "You think she's going to remember your name tomorrow? She's too rich to care about people like us. That's the difference between her and us. Don't be naive." But Claire shook her head. "No, you're wrong. You looked at me like she understood. She cared more than you ever will." Richard dismissed her with a wave, but deep down, her words stung. He had seen that look too, the one that made him feel small without Evelyn saying a word. It haunted him even as he tried to laugh it off. The next day, the whispers had spread beyond the restaurant. Local news blogs picked it up: Black billionaire humiliated at luxury restaurant. Social media posts appeared with blurry photos, taken by diners, each caption more dramatic than the last. Some framed Evelyn as a victim, others praised her composure, and still others mocked the restaurant for allowing such disrespect to happen to a world-famous figure. Richard thought the attention would fade in a day or two. But Evelyn knew better. She understood the power of narrative, how a small story could become a wave if guided correctly. And she had no intention of letting the story die quietly. She contacted a trusted friend in the media, someone who respected her enough to handle the truth with dignity. She didn't ask for pity or headlines of outrage. Instead, she asked for the story to highlight something deeper, the way people respond to disrespect, the way silence can be strength, and the way grace can reveal more than anger ever could. When the article came out, it wasn't about humiliation, it was about resilience. It described how Evelyn had chosen dignity over anger, how she had treated the waitress with compassion, and how she had left the restaurant with her head held high. Readers around the world were inspired. Comments flooded in from people who said her calmness gave them courage to face their own challenges with dignity. The whispers had turned into a movement. People weren't just talking about spilled juice. Anymore, they were talking about strength, grace, and power. Richard, however, felt the pressure mounting. Customers started canceling reservations, unsure if they wanted to be associated with a place known for humiliating its guests. Some employees, began to question his leadership more openly, inspired by Evelyn's quiet defiance. Claire, though still nervous, found a new strength inside her. If Evelyn could carry herself with such dignity in the face of humiliation, surely she could find the courage to stand up for what was right. And through it all, Evelyn remained. Silent on the surface, letting the whispers grow, letting them build the stage she was preparing to step onto. She didn't need to defend herself. The crowd was already doing it for her, because Evelyn Carter understood something Richard never would. Whispers may start small, but if you let them, they can shake the walls of arrogance, topple those who think they are untouchable, and pave the way for change. And this was only the beginning. The crowd had whispered. The world had listened. Now Evelyn was ready for her next move. The story of Evelyn Carter at the seaside restaurant was no longer just a local whisper. Within days, it had reached newspapers, online blogs, and social media platforms across the country. People debated endlessly. Was her silence true strength, or hidden weakness? Some admired her grace under pressure, others insisted she should have demanded immediate justice. But Evelyn, sitting quietly in her penthouse office overlooking the city skyline, knew exactly what she was doing. Her silence had bought her time, and now it was time to act. For most people, revenge meant shouting, punishing, or lashing out. But Evelyn had learned through decades of experience that real revenge was never loud. It was precise, calculated, and devastating in its effectiveness. She had not built her empire by reacting emotionally to insults. She had built it by turning every obstacle into a stepping stone. And this time, she would do the same. So, this time she would do it so thoroughly that Richard, the arrogant restaurant boss, would never forget it. She began with research. Evelyn called her assistant, a sharp young woman named Naomi, and asked for a full report on the restaurant chain. Naomi worked quickly, gathering financial data, employee reviews, management reports, and even details of recent investor meetings. By evening, Evelyn had a clear picture in front of her. The chain was successful on the surface, but cracks were showing low employee satisfaction, high turnover, and whispers of mismanagement. The kind of cracks that someone with influence could easily widen. Evelyn didn't want to simply punish Richard for humiliating her. She wanted to expose the entire culture of arrogance he represented. She wanted to turn her personal insult into a lesson for the entire organization. More importantly, into an opportunity to build something better. The next step was subtle. Evelyn reached out to a few quiet connections she had in the investment world. These were people who trusted her judgment, people who had seen her turn struggling companies into industry leaders. She didn't tell them the full story. She didn't need to. She simply hinted that she was interested in acquiring shares in the restaurant chain. Her reputation alone was enough to make investors listen. Meanwhile, the restaurant continued to suffer under the weight of the growing scandal. Customers who once bragged about dining there now hesitated. Online reviews were flooded with references to the Billionaire incident. Some diners wrote that, if such disrespect could happen to Evelyn Carter, what hope did ordinary people have? Bookings dropped, and the board of directors grew restless. They called Richard in for a meeting demanding an explanation. He dismissed the whole thing as overblown gossip, insisting it would pass. But even as he spoke, he felt the shadow of Evelyn's silence hanging over him, Claire. The young waitress lived in fear of losing her job. But to her surprise, something strange was happening. Customers who recognized her from the viral story began treating her with kindness, some even tipping generously. A few whispered encouragement. You were brave to face her, but don't let them bully you. Claire didn't feel brave as she felt guilty. Yet in her heart, she couldn't forget the way Evelyn had looked at her. Not with anger, but with understanding. That look had given her the courage to keep going, even when Richard snapped at her back in her office. Evelyn moved her pieces like a master chess player. She met privately with a few board members of the restaurant chain. People who were dissatisfied with Richard's leadership but too cautious to speak openly. She didn't threaten them. She didn't even mention the juice incident. Instead, she spoke about opportunity. She described a vision for the chain that valued employees, prioritized dignity, and built customer loyalty through respect. Her words were calm but powerful, and her reputation gave them weight. By the end of the meetings, she had quietly secured Allies. Richard, oblivious to the storm gathering around him, continued as usual. He barked orders at his staff, rolled his eyes at complaints, and smirked whenever Evelyn's name came up. He told himself she was too busy, too wealthy, to waste her time on him. She's forgotten about it already, he told his assistant. But deep down he wasn't sure. The first real blow came when a major news outlet published an editorial praising Evelyn's grace at the restaurant while criticizing the chain's leadership for failing to protect its guests. The article was widely shared, sparking debates on television panels and talk shows. Investors grew nervous. Stock prices dipped. For the first time, Richard felt the walls closing in. And then, one morning, an announcement hit the business world. Like lightning, Evelyn Carter had quietly acquired a controlling stake in the restaurant chain, and no one had seen it coming. One day, Richard was the confident manager of a luxury branch. The next, his ultimate critic had become his ultimate boss. When the news reached him, Richard turned pale, tried to laugh it off in front of his staff, but his hands shook as he poured himself a drink. The whispers in the restaurant grew louder. Employees exchanged hopeful looks, sensing change was coming. Claire nearly dropped a tray when she heard the news. She whispered to another waitress, "She's the owner now, after everything?" Yes, Evelyn was the owner now, and she didn't waste time. Within days, she announced sweeping changes. New employee training programs, anti-discrimination policies, and leadership accountability measures were put in place. She didn't fire everyone at once. She knew revenge was more powerful when it was deliberate. But Richard's position was immediately reviewed. He was stripped of authority, placed by a manager who valued dignity over arrogance. The irony was sharp. The man who had tried to humiliate her with a glass of juice was now reduced to explaining his failures to the very woman he had mocked. Evelyn didn't yell, didn't insult, didn't even gloat. She simply looked at him with the same calm eyes she had used that day at the restaurant. Leadership, she told him softly, isn't about power over people. It's about power with people. You forgot that, and that's why you lost. Richard had no answer. His smirk was gone. His arrogance shattered. For Evelyn, this was not just revenge, it was transformation. She had turned a moment of disrespect into an opportunity to uplift an entire organization. Employees who had once worked in fear now felt hope. Customers who had turned away began returning, drawn by the promise of a new culture. And Claire, the young waitress who had once trembled with guilt, was offered mentorship and training, supported by Evelyn herself. The whispers that had started with spilled juice had become a roar of admiration. People across the world spoke of Evelyn Carter's ruthless revenge, though those who understood her knew it wasn't ruthlessness at all. It was justice delivered with grace, power guided by wisdom, and revenge redefined as transformation. Evelyn sat one evening in her office, watching the city lights. She thought back to that moment when juice had dripped down her face and the crowd had waited for her reaction. If she had shouted then, the story would have ended there. Had chosen silence, the story had grown into something far greater. She smiled to herself, sipping a glass of water. Her revenge was complete not because Richard had been defeated, but because dignity had triumphed. Justice had been served, and an empire of arrogance had been turned into a legacy of respect. And yet Evelyn knew this was only one chapter of her journey. Because for people like her, every act of revenge was not an ending. It was the beginning of something even greater. Asterisk, the moment Evelyn Carter took control of the restaurant chain. The air inside every branch changed. The employees who once walked on eggshells around Richard and his kind finally felt a quiet hope stirring in their hearts. They whispered to each other in the kitchen, in the storage rooms, even during their short breaks. Some couldn't believe it. How could the very woman who had been humiliated under their roof now be the one signing their paychecks? Others smiled knowingly, saying, "That's real power. It's quiet, patient, and unstoppable." Richard, however, could not hide his fury. For years, he had strutted around like a king inside his little kingdom, barking orders at staff, belittling those who couldn't fight back, and pretending he owned the place. But now, the truth was laid bare. He was nothing more than a middle manager in a chain he no longer controlled. Worse still, the woman he had tried to humiliate had become his boss. He tried to put on a brave face, but every time he walked into the restaurant, he felt the shift. The staff who once feared him no longer bowed their heads. They looked at him with defiance, some even with pity. That was worse than fear. Evelyn had no need to rush his downfall. She understood that arrogance doesn't collapse with one push, it crumbles piece by piece, till the person holding it together can no longer stand. And that was exactly what happened to Richard. The board of directors, encouraged by Evelyn's steady leadership, began reviewing Richard's record. They uncovered complaints that had been buried, resignations that had never been questioned, and financial waste that had been ignored because no one had dared to confront him. Employees who had once stayed silent began speaking up. Claire, the timid waitress who had carried out his cruel instructions, finally found the courage to tell her truth. With Evelyn's support, she confessed to the board that she had been pressured to humiliate the billionaire that day. Her voice trembled, at first, but then grew stronger as she realized she was no longer powerless. The room was silent as she spoke. Richard tried to interrupt, calling her a liar, but no one listened to him anymore. The weight of evidence against him was too heavy. His arrogance was finally exposed for what it truly was, a mask for insecurity and weakness. When Evelyn entered that meeting room, all eyes turned to her. She did not gloat. She did not raise her voice. She simply walked to the head of the table and looked at Richard, the man who had once smirked as juice dripped down her face. Arrogance, she said softly, has a short life. It burns bright, but it burns out quickly. Real leadership outlives arrogance every time. Richard had no reply. For the first time in his career, he was speechless. The board voted unanimously to remove him from his position. His name, once feared inside the restaurant, was erased from the chain's leadership within days. But Evelyn's vision went beyond removing one arrogant man. She knew that arrogance is like a weed, grows back unless the soil is changed. So she began transforming the entire culture of the chain. She met with employees, not just managers. She listened to waiters, chefs, and cleaners, asking them about their struggles and their ideas for improvement. Many were shocked at first. No one had ever cared to ask them before. But slowly, they began to believe that things could truly change. She introduced policies that rewarded respect and integrity, not just profit. She created scholarship programs for young employees who wanted to study further. Roles to those who had once been ignored, people who led with kindness instead of fear. Customers noticed the difference almost immediately. Service improved, the atmosphere grew warmer, and the brand's reputation, once tarnished by scandal, began to shine brighter than ever before. Richard, on the other hand, faded into obscurity. He tried to sue, tried to argue, tried to claim he had been treated unfairly, but no one wanted to listen. The world had moved on, inspired by Evelyn's grace and strength. In the end, his arrogance collapsed under its own weight. He had built his identity on fear and cruelty, and when those crumbled, he had nothing left. Meanwhile, Claire's life transformed completely. No longer living in fear of losing her job, she blossomed under Evelyn's mentorship. Evelyn saw potential in Hertha, same kind of potential she had once carried as a young woman fighting to prove herself. She encouraged Claire to take classes, to build her skills, and to believe in herself. Claire still remembered the moment juice had spilled from her hands, the shame that had nearly broken her. But now, she realized that moment had been the turning point of her life. Because Evelyn had chosen compassion instead of anger, she had been given a second chance. The public loved the story. Media outlets called Evelyn's takeover the most elegant revenge in business history. Commentators praised her ability to turn humiliation into transformation. To the world, it looked like ruthless revenge. But those who understood her knew the truth. It wasn't ruthlessness. It was wisdom. It was patience. It was the power of a woman who refused to be broken. Evelyn herself never called it revenge. In interviews, when journalists asked her why she bought the restaurant chain, she simply smiled and said, "I believe in turning pain into purpose. If you've been given an opportunity to change something, why waste it on anger when you can? Build something better?" Her words traveled far beyond the business world. Young women quoted her in speeches. College students wrote essays about her. Entrepreneurs framed her story as a lesson in resilience, and ordinary people, facing their own battles in everyday life, found courage in her calm dignity. The fall of arrogance wasn't just about Richard. It was about a bigger truth, that arrogance will always lose to resilience, and cruelty will always fall before grace. Evelyn's story proved that you don't need to fight loudly to win. Sometimes the quietest moves are the most powerful. One evening, long after Richard had disappeared from the headlines, Evelyn returned to the seaside restaurant where it had all begun. She sat at the same corner table, wearing another blue dress, her favorite color. The staff greeted her warmly, not with fear, but with respect and admiration. Claire, now a confident manager herself, served her a glass of orange juice this time with steady hands and a smile. Evelyn lifted the glass, looked out at the ocean, and smiled. She had turned humiliation into triumph, arrogance into ashes, and whispers into a legacy. And as the waves crashed softly against the shore, she knew that her silence on that fateful day had been the most powerful answer of all. Asterisk. When Evelyn Carter officially became the controlling owner of the restaurant chain, many people expected her to run it like any other business. They thought she would focus on profits, expand locations, and polish the brand until it looked shiny enough to attract wealthy customers again. But Evelyn had no interest in creating a shallow empire. She wanted something deeper, something lasting. For her, the restaurant chain was not just a business, it was a platform to show the world what true transformation looked like. From the very beginning, Evelyn made it clear that her mission went beyond money. She wanted to create a culture where people felt valued, respected, and uplifted. To her, food wasn't only about taste, it was about experience. A restaurant wasn't just a place to eat, it was a place to feel welcome, to connect with others, to belong. And she wanted everyone from customers to employees to walk away with more than just a full stomach. She wanted them to walk away with dignity. The changes started small, but spread quickly. Evelyn introduced fair pay programs to ensure every employee, from the dishwashers in the back to the servers at the front, was treated with the same importance. She launched scholarships for staff members who wanted to study, whether it was culinary arts, business, or any other field. If you're willing to work hard, she told them, I'll help you grow. Those words alone brought tears to the eyes of employees who had spent years believing no one cared about their dreams. Claire was among the first to benefit. Once a nervous, fearful waitress who had been manipulated into humiliating Evelyn, she was now given the chance to study management. Evelyn personally mentored her, guiding her with patience and kindness. Claire often admitted she still carried guilt for what happened that day, but Evelyn always reassured her. What matters, she said gently, is not the mistake but what you choose to do afterward. You've chosen courage. That's what defines you now. The customers noticed the difference too. Gone were the tense, uncomfortable atmospheres where staff worked in fear. Instead, there was warmth in the air, genuine smiles on the faces of servers, and a sense of pride in the way they carried themselves. Diners felt it immediately, and word began to spread. People didn't just come for the food anymore, they came for the experience, for the way they felt respected the moment they walked in. The media continued to follow the story closely. Reporters asked Evelyn about her vision, about why she invested so much time and resources into changing the culture instead of just focusing on profits. Her answer was simple. Money will follow when people are treated right. Success that is built on arrogance doesn't last. But success built on respect becomes a legacy. Those words were repeated across headlines, quoted in business schools, and shared widely on social media, and indeed money did follow. The restaurant chain, once at risk of collapse after the scandal, began to thrive like never before. Customers returned in large numbers, impressed not only by the improved service, but also by the story behind it. Investors who had once doubted the future of the chain now scrambled to buy shares, recognizing that Evelyn had turned a liability into a gold mine. But Evelyn didn't see her work as revenge. She saw it as grace, where others might have destroyed the business just to punish Richard. She chose to transform it into something that would outlive both of them. Her goal was never to humiliate him. It was to prove that respect and dignity could rebuild, something stronger than arrogance ever could. Richard, meanwhile, had become a footnote in the story. After his dismissal, he tried to speak out against Evelyn, but no one listened. His arrogance, once his weapon, had now become his curse. Every attempt he made to explain himself only reminded people of his downfall. He faded quietly from public view. Evelyn's name rose higher with every success. Inside the restaurants, employees felt the change in their own lives. One young cook who had been saving money for years to attend culinary school was surprised when Evelyn announced she would sponsor his education. Another waitress, who had been working double shifts to support her children, cried when she received a promotion that gave her both better pay and more time with her family. These stories spread through the staff like wildfire, inspiring them to give their best every day. For the first time, they felt like they weren't just working a job, they were part of something meaningful. Evelyn also started a program called Second Chances, aimed at hiring people who had been rejected elsewhere. Single mothers, former inmates, young people with no experience. She believed everyone deserved an opportunity to rise, just as she had once been given. And the results were astonishing. Employees who had once been discarded by society became some of the chain's most loyal and hardworking staff members. Customers noticed the pride in their service. The restaurants became known not only for their food, but for their heart. What started as a personal insult had grown into a movement. People across the country looked at Evelyn's story as proof that grace was not weakness. Grace in its truest form was power, was the ability to take pain and turn it into purpose. To take humiliation and turn it into hope. To take an enemy's cruelty and transform it into something that uplifted countless others. Evelyn often thought back to that day at the seaside restaurant, the moment when juice spilled over her head, and whispers filled the air. She remembered the laughter, the stares, the way Richard had smirked as if he had won something. And she remembered her silence, how hard it had been to hold her composure, how tempting it had been to shout. But now, sitting in her office years later, she smiled. That silence had been the seed. Without it, none of this transformation would have happened. Claire, now a confident manager of her own branch, often told new employees the story. Not in a way that embarrassed Evelyn, but in a way that inspired. Our boss taught me something. She would say, when life tries to humiliate you, you don't always have to fight back with anger. Sometimes the best revenge is to rise so high that the same people who tried to push you down end up watching you lift others. The employees would listen, nodding, feeling proud to be part of the chain. Gosh. And Evelyn, hearing those words secondhand, felt her heart swell with quiet joy. She had built more than a business. She had built a legacy of grace. Her ruthless revenge had never been about destruction. It had been about creation, creating opportunities, creating dignity, creating hope. And as long as her restaurant stood, serving meals with respect and warmth, that revenge would continue to echo, leaving behind a story that generations would never forget. Years had passed since that unforgettable afternoon at the seaside restaurant, when a glass of orange juice had spilled over Evelyn Carter's head. To most people, it was a story that had been told and retold in whispers, articles, interviews, and social media posts. But to Evelyn, it was never just about juice or humiliation, or even revenge. It was about what followed, the choices she made afterward. The transformation that came from holding on to dignity instead of anger. That day had been the spark, but the legacy it created was far larger than anyone could have imagined by now. Evelyn's restaurant chain was no longer just a chain, it had become a movement. People across the country traveled miles just to eat there, not only for the food, but for the story behind it. Every customer who sat down at one of her tables felt like they were part of something bigger, something meaningful. Employees greeted guests with genuine warmth. News carried short messages about hope and resilience, and walls were decorated not just with art, but with words of encouragement. It was unlike any other dining experience because Evelyn had turned it into something more than business. She had turned it into a reminder of what grace could build. Claire, once the trembling waitress who had accidentally humiliated Evelyn under Richard's orders, was now a regional manager overseeing several branches. Her transformation was one of Evelyn's proudest achievements. Claire had gone from fear and guilt to confidence and leadership. She often stood in front of new employees during training sessions, sharing her story honestly, not hiding her mistake, but showing how a second chance had changed her life. "I thought I had ruined everything that day," she would tell them. "But Evelyn showed me that people are not defined by one mistake. We are defined by what we do after the mistake. And that is why I'm standing here today, helping all of you grow." Employees would applaud, inspired, and many would whisper to each other, "If she could rise, so can we." The fall of Richard, once the arrogant boss who believed he was untouchable, had become a cautionary tale within the industry. Name had vanished from the headlines, his career erased by his own pride. Whenever people discussed poor leadership, his story was quietly used as an example. But Evelyn never spoke of him publicly again. She didn't need to. His arrogance had destroyed itself. While her grace had built a legacy that continued to shine, Evelyn's empire extended far beyond restaurants. With the profits she earned, she invested in schools, scholarships, and mentorship programs. She believed that dignity began with opportunity, and she wanted young people, especially those from communities like the one she had grown up in, to believe in their own potential. "I don't want you to dream small because people tell you to," she often told students. "I want you to dream so big that even your failures will look like victories." Her speeches were shared worldwide, her words inspiring millions who had never even stepped foot inside her restaurants. The legacy she built wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet but powerful, just like her silence that day at the seaside. Her story was told in classrooms, in homes, in workplaces where people faced disrespect and wondered how to respond. And more often than not, someone would say, "Remember Evelyn Carter? I remember how she didn't fight back with anger, but with grace. Remember how she turned humiliation into transformation?" One evening, Evelyn found herself once again at the original seaside restaurant where it all began. It had been remodeled since she took over, with warm lights, inviting decor, and a menu that highlighted local ingredients. Families laughed at tables, couples toasted to anniversaries, the staff moved confidently through the room, no longer afraid of being yelled at by arrogant managers. The atmosphere was light, hopeful, alive. Claire, dressed in a smart suit as the regional manager, walked over to Evelyn's table, carrying a glass of orange juice. This time she said with a smile, "I promise it makes it to the table." Evelyn laughed softly, accepting the glass. They shared a quiet moment, remembering how far they had both come since that day. What had once been a symbol of humiliation was now a symbol of victory, of growth, of second chances. As Evelyn sipped the juice, she looked out at the ocean. The waves moved endlessly, just as they had that day years ago. She thought about how life had tried to knock her down in that moment, how the world had expected her to explode in anger, to demand punishment. But instead, she had chosen silence. And that silence had given her the power to turn one cruel act into a legacy that touched thousands of lives. She realized then that her revenge had never truly been ruthless, had been graceful. Ruthless in its impact, perhaps, but graceful in its method. She hadn't destroyed, she had rebuilt. She hadn't shouted, she had listened. She hadn't dragged people down, she had lifted them up. And that, she knew, was the kind of revenge that lasts. Her story became a reminder that true power is not in crushing enemies but in transforming situations. Anyone can destroy, but only the truly strong can rebuild something better out of pain. And Evelyn Carter had done just that. As she finished her meal and prepared to leave, a young girl approached her table with wide eyes. She was perhaps 12 years old, holding a small notebook. "Miss Carter," she said shyly, "can I ask you something?" Evelyn smiled warmly and nodded. The girl took a deep breath and asked, "How did you stay so calm that day when they were mean to you? Get upset really fast when people are unfair, and I want to be strong like you." Evelyn reached out, placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder, and said, "Being calm doesn't mean you don't feel hurt. It means you choose not to let the hurt control you. Strength isn't about being louder than others. Sometimes it's about being quieter, so quiet that your actions do the speaking for you. And when you rise, make sure you bring others up with you. That's the kind of strength that lasts." The girl nodded, her eyes shining, and ran back to her family, clutching her notebook as if it carried a treasure. Aline watched her go, her heart full. That was her legacy, not just buildings or profits, but lives touched, minds inspired. And futures changed as she stepped out of the restaurant and walked into the cool night air. Evelyn Carter smiled to herself. She knew the whispers that had once followed her. Humiliation had grown into something far greater, a story that would continue to inspire long after she was gone. Her revenge had been called ruthless, but in truth, it had been graceful. And that grace had left behind something more powerful than wealth, more powerful than fear, more powerful than arrogance. It had left behind a legacy. A legacy that proved to the world that no matter how hard someone tries to break you, if you answer with dignity, with patience, and with grace, you will not only rise, you will rise in a way that no one can ever bring you down again. And that, Evelyn knew, was the true meaning of victory.